Hi and welcome. I'm Marcus Breen and this is another episode of Boston Media Theory. Today I'm very delighted to have here Tom Fiedler, Dean of the College of Communication at Boston University. And as usual, we're going to be talking about issues and concerns that we have related to media and communication and their application and, if you like, their study in the city of Boston. And we talk to academics, we talk to researchers, and well, today we're talking to an administrator. So welcome, Tom.
I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks very much for being here. And I wanted to talk today particularly about what's happening in media communication and the education of those fields at the university level. So what is happening where what we call convergence has been having a large impact on otherwise discrete or separate fields, and where these fields are being brought together through new media, mainly the internet.
Yeah.
So that's really what I want to talk about and see what you're doing at Boston University, because I know there's some interesting work being done.
Well, convergence is really just a part of it. I think it wasn't really more than 20 years ago when the major, what we think of as mainstream media, mainstream communication, kind of operated in their own technology pipelines. You know, the film and television had their own technologies and delivery systems to connect with their audiences. Of course, newspapers themselves, all by themselves, it was putting words on paper with ink and then putting those papers in trucks and sending them all over to deliver to people. Radio and so forth had its own technology. So when we talk about convergence, I think what happened was that the technologies began to be shared. Initially, when the internet and the web came along, it was the early days. It was just simply perhaps a digital version of the way they used to be. I mean, the original newspaper website was just you took the words that were on paper and you put them on a screen and sent it out there. Not much difference, and pretty much the same was true of radio and so forth. But what has happened, though, really in more recent years, and with the advent of broadband, with almost instantaneous communication now on the web, streaming video, for instance, streaming audio, where it's happening right now, and into our cell phones, that convergence doesn't even get close to approaching what's happened. This has really been a complete disruption of the old ways of doing it, and the advent, the birth of so many different ways that we now can communicate individually with each other, or one person can communicate literally to everybody in the world without having to go through a traditional media filter. So social media didn't really exist 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Facebook didn't come out of a Harvard dormitory until 2004. So again, I think in a very short period of time we have seen, and we're in the middle of still, a revolution that is often compared to what happened after Gutenberg invented movable type, and then it took decades before people began to appreciate the impact. Now we're seeing that impact, I mean, literally almost every day.
It's happening very quickly.
Right.
Everybody who's been on this program has explained where they've come from, as it were, and their previous lives and the experience that they brought to their research or their understanding of media and communication. And so, like me, you came from a background in journalism.
Right.
And I think you're a Pulitzer Prize winner.
That's correct.
And so that's great. So maybe you could give us some insights into how you've moved from journalism to see this change in media and in communication.
Well, it's interesting you use the word moved from journalism. I mean, I personally certainly did. I spent 36 years in a newspaper news environment, most of that at the Miami Herald. And it was in my last 6 years at the Miami Herald, I was the editor of the paper, the editor-in-chief of the paper. And that was started in 2001, and that's really when we began to incorporate into our newsroom what was happening in with Convergence,
right.
and that was actually even in before social media became a part of that, but where we came to the conclusion that we couldn't consider ourselves to be a newspaper newsroom anymore. We had to consider ourselves as being a newsroom that produced content that would appear in the newspaper, but that also would appear in our website. It would be online, and we would distribute it individually through even mobile phones then, through RSS and so forth. And it was an existential change. I mean, really, we had to think of ourselves as something different and reinvent what we did. Now, there are I'll go back to the definition of being a journalist. I mean, that are constant in a sense. I do believe the discipline of journalism remains the same, or it should remain the same. I think there are some tensions around it now, but that the discipline itself of gathering information, important information, relevant information to people's lives, people's decision making, and delivering that information to your news consumer in a way that person can then make use of it. I think that is a valuable discipline, and irrespective of how it's delivered, should remain constant. And one of the things, one of the most important things I think we do in journalism education now is to make the point to our students that in their lifetimes, in their careers, the way they connect with their news audience is very apt to change. It's probably going to change in ways that we're not even envisioning right now. Maybe we'll inject it directly into people's brains or something somehow. But what we hope won't be lost in that is the essence of what good journalism is, which is fact-based, which is fundamentally fair and objective and that kind of thing. So we want them to be able to at least hold on to that constant.
Do students get it? Do they understand that the perhaps tried and true principles of the pursuit of truth and public interest around journalism will continue?
No, they absolutely do believe that, and I think hold hold the same values that our generation had and generations going before, and they want to continue that. But they are being shaped by these changes in the way they go about gathering information and the way they distribute it. The pressures on this generation are, I believe, intense and growing more intense. There's the expectation, for instance, if you're a journalist working for even what we consider the mainstream news organization, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, one of the television station or network, not only are you expected to be covering your beat still, gathering information and producing it, perhaps writing it for a newspaper or to go over the air as part of a script, you're supposed to also be feeding perhaps Twitter followers, with tweets constantly, or maybe you have Facebook pages that you're supposed to also feed into. Maybe you're supposed to blog a certain amount, and I worry a little bit about that expectation will come at the cost of either more reflection about what you're doing, or making that extra effort to get one more interview that might be helpful, might provide more context, one more conversation with someone rather than exchanging a text message.
Right.
But there is a cost about that I worry on. But I think as far as young people today who expect to be journalists, believe that what they're doing has value and matters, to be the conveyors of truth, so to speak, I think they very much want that to go on.
Yes, and of course the whole idea of how a newspaper office and journalism worked was really established by this kind of gatekeeper mechanism where there was a very clear function, and so new media, and whether it's Twitter or social media, tends to say, well, who needs a gatekeeper? I can speak directly to an audience, and an audience can talk back. So the interactive component really makes it different, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, in many ways, the old the hinges have been blown off those gates, and people can go back and forth. But I do believe what does remain in place is, yes, someone can throw something up there in Twitter, put it on Facebook, somehow throw it up in social media, and it can get picked up and the expression can go viral. But when something does take off like that, almost in most cases, certainly if it's something that involves public policy, and then what really matters still is that there be some kind of verification and validation that people trust, that audiences trust, and that still more often than not will come from trusted news sources. It could come from legacy brands, you know, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, those kinds of things. I think that still does matter to people if it's been picked up and they're producing it. And you say, oh, okay, I'll tend to pay attention. There is that it adds a dimension of integrity to that.
Sure. Although it must be said that at the other level, not so much of journalism, but at the other level of, if you like, public opinion and perhaps revolt, as we've seen with some of the social movements more recently around the shootings of black men, there's been a sense that people can organise very quickly. And the media is really scrambling after the people who are organised to protest or to organise some sort of policy activity or some sort of activity that has policy implications. That seems to change the territory a bit too.
Well, it certainly speeds it up, accelerates it. There's no question that the media's, social media's ability to assemble people, and when you follow, once a hashtag is assigned to something and people start following it there, that ability to gather a crowd, to concentrate people into one area and focus on one concern, is probably unprecedented in our history. And the media then becomes, the mainstream media becomes one of those that has to follow along. Yes, everything we've seen this happen in political revolution. It's you know, Tahrir Square and places like that.
The Arab Spring.
Just the Arab Spring. The power of social media to just transmit information to people and to compel them to some action, to some common action, is really extraordinary. You know, it took Paul Revere a long time to ride. You know, to arms, the British are coming. You know, you send out a tweet today, and you'd have all the villages and farms, so to speak, out there ready to take on the redcoats in a heartbeat.
Well, not only that, everybody around the world can watch
That's right. The tweet. Follow it as you tweet along the way, right?
It's really quite stunning. And of course, you have at Boston University the Conversation, which offers another style of communication, journalism, immediacy, and if you like, dissemination of information. That's at a whole other level again, but still based in your college.
Yeah, well, we're delighted that they had asked us if we would help them as their host. I don't know, for your listeners, the Conversation is, it really is a unique news provider in that it's that combination. The slogan that they use is academic rigor, journalistic flair. That's the slogan that they have, but what that means is this is information, this is news in many ways that's provided by people who are experts in subject areas. Subjects that are being talked about today. It could be something that's happening, you know, in the Middle East, perhaps, or something that's happened in economics, or even something happening in our own culture. Bruce Jenner going through a gender reassignment issue, and I think what people are hungry for and what they're looking for in journalism is information that's coming to them from an expert. It's someone who says, this is what this means. And but in many cases, I don't know quite how I say this without offending some of my colleagues in academia, very often the people who are experts in academia at universities, they're not well trained in how to write in a way that the regular person, you know, you and I would be able to just read and say, oh, I understand that, and I find it interesting. Most scholars learn to write for other scholars. And And it can be heavy slogging if you're not a scholar when you get into it. So what the Conversation has done, it's theconversation.com is the website, is they literally partner the subject expert, the academic, with a journalist who knows how to take information and produce it in a way that most of us can read and do read every day, and we produce that every day on that website. So if you want to find out what an expert thinks about, say, drought in California and floods in Texas or something, it's quite likely there is somebody who has studied the science of that, and can provide some information for you that you'd find interesting and maybe useful. And you can do it reading that just as if you had read that in your local paper or something presented. They have the Conversation started in Australia. That was the concept in Australia between the University of Melbourne and the former editor of the biggest newspaper there, the Melbourne Age. His name is Andrew Jaspin, and it immediately became a go-to website in Australia. I think I'm correct in saying that there are more people who visit that website in Australia now than any other news website in that country.
Right? Yeah.
And then they sort of leaped the globe, and they established a second Conversation, theconversation.com/UK in the United Kingdom and Great Britain, and that's been going for a couple of years. And then a little over a year ago, they approached us at Boston University and asked us if we would at least provide a home for them, and because they wanted to establish a conversation for academics in the United States. We were thrilled because I think this is a new kind of journalism that will be appreciated by most people, and for us to be the site where it originates, I think, is kind of a feather in our caps. So.
Right. Well, it also means that it gives your students, I assume, some access to, again, a different or an emerging model of communication.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they do. Now, our students have an opportunity to work there as interns,
Right.
but I think just to be exposed to the kind of journalism that is being done, I think is a plus. I was involved several years ago. Before I came to Boston University, I left the Miami Herald, and I spent a year at the Kennedy School. And one of the projects that I worked on was funded by the Carnegie and the Knight Foundation. And it really was about to look into what is the future and what is the role of journalism education. And one of the things that I think we concluded was that there needed to be, that journalism education needed to be focused on not just the skill sets that a journalist has to have. I mean, that's certainly part of it, but that journalists also had to develop expertise in topics. That it was not enough anymore that a journalist would go out and say, okay, you don't believe in climate change, so I'm going to interview you and get a quote from you about why you don't believe it, and go to someone else and say, you definitely believe in climate change, so you give me a quote, and then I write up the story, and I have this person says this and this person says that, and I'm done as a journalist.
Right.
That's not journalism, that's pseudo-journalism. And so the idea was, well, where do we find can we realistically train a journalist to be an expert? Well, to some extent we can. But this concept that the Conversation came forward with immediately solved the problem without requiring a journalist to go on and get PhDs in certain subjects, because we can go get the PhD and we work with that PhD, and then we use our skills. We can teach that, or working with that PhD, we can take that information and present it in a way that most people would enjoy reading.
Yes, and we can all, of course, have our own channels if we so choose.
Absolutely right.
So I blog, I can blog, I
That's
can
right.
tweet, as can you.
And you get engaged, so you can comment, and
Yes, I mean, not only on the conversation, but any number of other opportunities to engage in what is really a very fragmentary knowledge environment.
Well, it's true, Marcus. But I also, that there's the old line about Everybody is entitled to his own opinion, but not entitled to their own facts. You can't make up facts, and I think that's what's important. Is that and we need to be enlightened consumers of information and realize, okay, this is fact and this is opinion, and don't confuse the two. You and I can look at the same fact set and maybe have a different opinion about that, but you and I can't alter what those facts are. Right. And I think that's what we're, again, to go back to the conversation, some of what the conversation would present would be a judgment that an expert has made based on a fact set, but that fact set should still be there so that if I want to comment and say, well, I see that fact set, but my interpretation is different from that expert, and let me tell you why. And that's terrific that we can do that nowadays.
It absolutely is, and I think is a level of what we would consider, I think, in media studies in particular, empowerment that's really quite dramatic.
Yes.
Not only for journalists, but for a number of different outputs and sources. One of the things that I also wanted to draw to our attention was what you're doing in the department with this field, which I think you've called emerging media studies.
Yes.
And how you seek to address not only journalism, but what were previously and are still mostly, I think for the most part in universities, separate areas: public relations, advertising, journalism, of course, media, cinema, and how you're using this idea of emerging media studies to approach this.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Well, it's really exciting. Emerging media, in some ways, is the connective tissue through all forms of public communication. I think where that came out of is shortly after I arrived at the College of Communication, which was in 2008, the university had gone through a strategic planning process where you try to say, well, what are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? How do we minimize those, maximize our strengths, and where do we want to go? What do we aspire to be, and how do we get there?
Typical stuff for a university to be doing. Yeah.
Right, and so we did that at the college to make sure, okay, the university's done it, what do we as a college need to be doing? And we went through that process. It took a good part of a year, a lot of thoughtful discussion, and but the one area that emerged as what we thought was the most important thing we need to do to again set ourselves on strategically was we had to make sure that we not only understood what was happening with the changes in the media, with this convergence, with really the revolution going on, but we wanted to be in a place where we could help lead that or shape it, so that we weren't always reacting to the changes. Yes. We might be helping to shape it and think about that. Yeah. And the only way you can do that is to have a strong research side where you're looking into what's happening and then trying to position yourself according to that. And I always thought of it, having lived in Florida for so long, that if you surf, for instance, if you're out there waiting for the wave to come and then you anticipate as the swell rises and you position yourself and you paddle right, that wave will pick you up and you'll always be in front of it and you'll have a terrific ride.
Beautiful.
But if you're too late, if that swell's there and just you miss it, you can paddle till you're blue in the face or till you hit the beach and you'll never catch it. And we didn't want to be in the position of having to try to catch up with something that went around. So then the thought was, well, how do we do this? How do we think about it? And what came from that was we were fortunate. We had a donor who provided funding to create this, what became the Division of Emerging Media Studies, and brought in someone who was a world-renowned thinker about how technology and social events come together. He was an expert in cellular telephones going back to the 1980s before anybody had one. And so we created this Division of Emerging Media Studies. We have a PhD program that now we have our first cohort of PhD students, and all of them are gathered around the idea of trying to understand what is the next new thing that's coming. How does that affect us? How does that affect a communicator trying to reach audiences? And so our hope is that by having this division of emerging media, these thinkers in the middle of our college, that it will in some ways infect the rest of the professions around it. That because if you're in PR, you're in advertising, or you're in journalism or film or whatever, you're affected by this.
Yeah,
and
right.
Again, we wanted to be in a place where not only did we understand what it was, but that we could help shape it too. So it became for us the engine that will help us drive change in a positive direction. It's really exciting.
Yes, and are you going to think about how these changes might then have implications more broadly for university education, or are you strictly
well, no, it's a good point. No, I think university education does become a part of it, because universities are rethinking again how to use the power of social media. For instance, a student audience is no different from an audience of consumers, in that both of them want to receive good information that they can use. And so why not use the tools that we're understanding and developing that might be available to PR or advertising or filmmakers or whatever? Why not use that in a classroom environment, or maybe get out of the classroom, but communicate in a way using those same tools? And yeah, we absolutely think that's a part of what we can do.
Well, it's a very exciting time to be in education for these kinds of reasons. The idea that knowledge is being unlocked through things like the conversation, that different forms of instruction are happening not only in colleges of communication, but potentially kind of, what do you say, acting like a virus right across the institution.
That's absolutely right. That's right.
And it changes the nature of the town-gown relationship potentially too, and I think that that's probably a little bit scary for some people.
Yeah, it may be, but you know, we're living in an era where almost all information is available to any one of us with a few keystrokes, and of course the knowledge to know what you're looking for and then how to use it once you get it. But I don't know that there could ever have been a more exciting time to be in education.
Right.
Really.
Well, we're out of time, Tom, so thank you very much. And that's it for us from Boston Media Theory. And from me until next time, Marcus Breen. See you later. Good night.